Good evening, everybody. Everybody hear me back there very well? Yeah? Great. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Klaus Bode. I'm part-time staff in the SED course, Sustainable Environmental Design course with Simos. I also work in practice, but I shall remain anonymous in terms of practice because I'm here in the academic capacity. It's going to be a pleasure to hear Shelley McNamara from Grafton Architects give a fantastic, I'm sure, lecture tonight to all of us. I just wanted to introduce her a little bit to you from our perspective. We've worked with Shelley, I've worked with Shelley over 11 years, and Yvonne and her whole team, and I just wanted to just mention a few things about Grafton Architects. Probably a very good way to describe it, and apologies for being simple here, but I think they're absolutely special people. And the word people is what I would like to underline. I can also say that out of all the architects that I've worked with, I enjoy the most working with Grafton Architects. What I find also amazing is that unlike many architects, their name doesn't come from themselves, but from Grafton Street, where they work from, which tells you a little bit about them. I find them, through the past history, very inquisitive, exploratory, very interested in challenging ways, asking lots of questions, and very much focused in the architecture on space, form, volume, light, and materiality. So very much in the senses, and for that is, for somebody like me who's very interested and passionate in environmental design and the environmental qualities in the world and the built environment that we live in, it is interesting that these two elements actually work very well and are synonymous, and maybe that is why Grafton Architects and myself and my anonymous bunch of people that work and support me have succeeded in working with them, I believe, quite well over many years. Yvonne and Shelley graduated in Ireland in 1974. In 1978, they set up Grafton Architects and undertook a series of projects, small to medium-sized projects, and I think the big step change came with the Temple Bar redevelopment in 1996, where there were a group, part of a group called Group 91. I think there was O'Donnell Two-Minute, and there were some other architects, and forgive me, I don't know all of them. But in 93 and 92, respectively, Gerard Carty and Philip O'Sullivan joined the practice, who are associate directors under the directions of Shelley and Yvonne. It's also great to get some more women architects leading the baton for architecture, and let the men come second. So our personal experience with working with Shelley was already in 2001 when we entered the Bocconi University, and she came to me and said, "Oh, why don't we do this competition in Italy?" And I said, "We're never going to win it." And she said, no, well, we should kind of do it. And I said, "I'm telling you, we're wasting our time in Italy doing a competition. We'll never win it." But she convinced me, and we did enter the competition. And the stories that happened in Milan after we won remain a secret of mine. But it was an amazing experience, and including having a bishop of Milan on the jury, which was quite interesting. So basically the journey from 2001 just moved up, in the sense that 2002 they were invited, the Venice Biennale, to exhibit Bocconi in the Italian pavilion, which was a first, I understand, for Irish architects, for sure. And the building was completed in 2008. And it was quite a long journey, quite difficult, but we had a supportive client. We had challenges, both from client and authorities, but we learned a hell of a lot, and it was an amazing experience. Since then, it's interesting that the Bocconi project itself, both in size and actually in value, I just did a quick, this typical engineers do a quick numerical evaluation, was bigger than all of their previous projects put together. So, something for the statistics book. Since 2008, other projects obviously started before they were completed, and I think propelled Grafton Architects on the international scene for sure. With Bocconi was also the Office for the Department of Finance in Dublin in 2007, then the University Limerick Medical School and Student Housing 2012, the University of Toulouse, Capitol, there's another project which we're working with Grafton, is ongoing in construction. The head offices for ESB Dublin, which was also one which is a very large project, I think was one almost 2 years ago, a year and a half ago. And last but not least, their current project, which is for the University Campus School of Engineering in Lima, Peru, which we also have been lucky enough to join them as a team and having won that project as well in the end of 2011, I believe. Obviously, with all those successes come the awards, the recognition for their contribution to architecture, both on the national and international scale, and rightfully so, numerous awards, both in Ireland and overseas, and also attractions to teach at various academic institutions. But just to name three again, coming back, is like I mentioned, 2002, the Venice Biennale, then one of the last 5 finalists for the Mies van der Rohe Prize in 2009. They did win the first World Architecture Festival when they did the World Building of the Year Award, and also for their category for Bocconi, so they won that one too. And last year, only just 2012, they got the Silver Lion at the Venice Biennale. I would like to just close by a citation from the jury for the Venice Biennale, and it says, "The jury believes that the conceptual and spatial qualities of this installation," Shelley will be talking probably about it, "demonstrate the considerable potential of this architectural practice in reimagining the urban landscape." I would like to welcome Shelley McNamara.
Thank you very much, Klaus. I'm not sure if this is working. Yeah, it is. I should also say that in the citation for the Silver Lion, that we were described as being the most promising emerging young practice, which we thought was quite refreshing, because we're always emerging. And I think the minute we stop emerging, we stop thinking. Yvonne and I have been using this term, architecture as new geography, for a number of, I suppose, years in our work. It's a theme we've been developing, probably as a way of finding our way through work and through projects. It's partly to do with a belief that buildings are not singular objects, but buildings grow out of both physical and cultural territory. And as more and more of the natural world disappears, we feel, and more people live in cities, we feel that the kinds of places that we as architects make, not just the kinds of buildings, but the kinds of places that we make, should feel like a kind of new geography. It also helps to come to terms with the scale of many projects being built throughout the world today. And in a sense, it's really thinking whether we're working at the scale of a single small project or working at something much larger, that we have the responsibility to make as rich as possible an environment, that somehow, because people are being disconnected from nature or the natural, that perhaps our role as architects is shifting slightly in terms of the as I say, the kind of environments that we make. We also think about architecture as a shield of our humanity, that architecture holds culture, especially at a time when perhaps globalization is the term that's bandied around today. We believe in the local and the particular and the difference of place and differences of different cultures. What I'm going to speak about this evening is I'm just going to lead in with a couple of general thoughts or things we talk about in the office in terms of how we start a project or think about a project. This image shows the Burren landscape in the west of Ireland, which is limestone karst landscape eroded by the rain, and on the other side the image of the wonderful Sver Fen Venice pavilion in the Giardini in Venice. And I suppose this image describes for us a preoccupation with ground and a preoccupation with sky and a preoccupation with the space that we make between the surfaces that we make. So we're interested in Yvonne quotes Alejandro de la Sota, who says that architects should make as much nothing as possible. And we interpret this idea of nothing as being the space between, that additional mysterious space that isn't required, isn't asked for, but that the architect can make. In terms of geography and architecture as new geography, this is a very, very early project, which, if you ignore the horrible curved roof, in a sense was our first exploration in how to make a building which is on the cliffs of Moher in the west of Ireland, how to make a building feel like a ruin and how to make a building feel like a piece of landscape. And I suppose that's something that we've continued to do in our projects, as I say, irrespective of what scale we're working on. This image by Chillida makes us think, both the maquettes and the projects which Chillida makes we find fascinating because of simply the sense of carving space, but also that architecture, Laurent Boudouin said about the work of Sver Fen that architecture is a machine for slowing time down. And in a sense, that image makes us think about that what is the role of architecture, and that it can slow you down and stop you in your steps and make you, I suppose, rediscover the world. And we use influences like this in terms of how we might think or start about a project, in terms of how we might carve an urban block, for instance, in order to allow the sunlight to penetrate deep into the block. We work very much in section, and we think a lot about trapped landscape and the relationship between inside and outside within the urban block, and I suppose about making environments where one can hear the bird song in the middle of the city, or one can enjoy the seasons or the time of day. And we were talking, I really enjoyed this afternoon with this unit where there was a lot of discussion about all the environmental implications of space making and of architecture, both at the urban scale and the scale of building. And sometimes we find it very good to come right back to basics, and especially in the making of something like an office building, which we're engaging in at the moment, to make space which isn't anonymous and which somehow allows people to do something as simple as enjoy the seasons and the time of day. I've talked about carving into the ground, but we're also interested in defying gravity. And structure for us is the skeleton, the key and the core of a project. So we very often start by thinking about, well, should a building, this is Lina Bobardi's The Structure for the Sao Paulo Museum. And we were so struck by this image when we saw it first. Again, there are certain moments when you can feel a shift in your work or in your palette of influences, and that was one of those moments. It was also interesting because she hangs, it's an 80-metre span, and some of these floors hang from the roof. And that was a strategy which we used in the building in Bocconi. So luckily we'd found this project just before we did that competition. But we're very interested in buildings having that ancient sense of mass bearing down or being borne up or moving within the forces of gravity. And that structure is a tool, it's not something that comes later, it's something that one thinks about from the beginning. Should something float? Should it defy gravity? Should it anchor into the ground? What is the structural quality? What is the spatial quality which will be translated by virtue of the nature of the structure? We love this image of Santiago de Compostela for many reasons. The primary reason being, I suppose, because one of our concerns is what level of intervention does an architect make in the city? How mute or how assertive should a building be? And Alvaro Siza describes this wall as being, I think it's something like that it has a monotonous and it has a monotonous presence, wavering somewhere between vibrancy and life, and almost nothing. And in an essay that he's written on walls, he talks about being jealous of this wall, that it can do so much by doing so little. And that's something that we do think about as architects, that the judgment that one makes about how one makes urban space as primary, and also what is the role of a new building in the making or the extending of the space of the city. Also, of course, it's in the rain, and it's these are drawings that Yvonne made in the west of Ireland on her holidays last summer of the rain and the thatch and the no gutter and the droplets of rain. And I suppose this is to do with our wish as architects to really be able to observe both the natural and the man-made city and urban conditions, and to stop and to draw and to take time to actually observe. It's something that it relates to every project that we do, and in our teaching we think that if an architect can see, then an architect can respond. I'm going to talk about 4 projects, one in Dublin and the other 3 outside of Dublin. And just in case you think we only want to work outside of Dublin, it's not the case, it's what's happened in our lives. And we love this quote from Rafael Moneo in the reader that went with the Venice Biennale this year, where he talks about the city that accompanies you, the city you travel in and with. And in his essay on common ground, he talks about the fact that if architects are to understand common ground, they need to know their own place in a very deep and extensive kind of way. And on the panel in his beside one of his drawings in the Venice Biennale, he says a very sobering thing, that architects need to know their own city and often don't get the chance to work in their own city. But he also says that sometimes we fail to ask to work in our own place. So sometimes we need to demand to work in our own place, even if there's no work to do, that we do something. So we believe passionately in the fact that we come out of one place and we go as strangers and as outsiders to other cities to try to understand their particular unique character. We map 1 hour's walk in Dublin, and again extending the thing of knowing one city in depth, that from this knowledge you can then start to look and perhaps understand or read other cities. So that mapping and reading is a hugely important thing for us, both physically and in the abstract scientific way that architects work. But to walk for 1 hour in Dublin is a completely different experience to walking for 1 hour in Milan through the man-made port and canals to the area where our building is built, And the man-made porting canals were built in order to build this amazing artificial landscape of the roof, well, not just the roof of the Duomo, but we were really inspired by the roof of the Duomo in Milan for its theatricality and for that sense that it felt like a sort of man-made mountain floating over the city. And Toulouse, again, a 1-hour walk through the new city, through the different layers into the historic medieval city with its Roman origins. Again, a completely different grain, completely different rhythm. I suppose it's like music, that one has to feel and understand the grain and the rhythm of a place before you can start to think about how to make an intervention in this place. One of the wonderful things about Toulouse is it has these really tiny, tiny courtyards. And the merchants in Toulouse receded deep into the block. They didn't occupy the buildings onto the main street. They receded deep into the block and made these secret towers, which at night they would come up to the roof and be able to speak to their merchants across the way. So it has a very particular kind of grain and a very particular kind of quality. And then, of course, going to Lima, which is something we've never experienced before, is of a scale which is astonishing, has a topography which is astonishing, with the Pacific Ocean, the beach, this 40-meter high cliff which separates the city from the sea, and our site is in a valley, a finger off this sea edge, and I'll be speaking about that later. But I suppose the point I'm trying to make is that I love this image of Oscar Kokoschka with his beady eye looking down over a destroyed Berlin. He was invited to make a painting just after the war, and he hadn't visited the city for 30 or 40 years. And the site or the area he was asked to paint was just at the point of the wall. And he was so saddened he felt he wouldn't be able to fulfill the commission. But yet he made this vibrant, optimistic painting full of life. And in a sense, we use this as a metaphor. First of all, I mentioned earlier about architects being able to see. And Louis Barragan talks about architects needing to see with innocence. And we feel that painters very often can capture the sensation of city more than architects, where sometimes we're dealing in a more rational, abstract world. But we're interested in also trying to record or respond to the sensation of city. Our Dublin typical street, Dublin is a street of houses. It's very different to London, even though it has many similarities. It's much more imperfect. Each of the houses is quite different, and this comes out of land ownership and leasehold issues, which is interesting that something as pragmatic as that can actually make the imperfections and the difference between the different houses, because one developer, people were only given certain size plots of land under the leasehold arrangement. So the techniques are the same, but the difference is obvious. And we really enjoy this loose weave of the city. But making projects in Dublin means you have to go back to your own place again and again to refresh and renew that is familiar to you. The sophistication of making houses which are defensive and welcoming, where, as I say, there's repetition, but there's difference. The simple thing of the white reveal to take light into the rooms, the fact that it's 50 to 70% solid, and yet you have a city with rooms filled with light. And we talked a lot today about glass buildings, and that each room has a presence on the roof. Yvonne calls them straws, like straws of air, taking the smoke out of the room or drawing the air in. And how painter Michael Caine has captured the sensation of Dublin, described by Anglo-Irish writer Elizabeth Bowen. She says that the brick in Dublin, even on not such bright days, has the capacity to seal up sunshine in the way that an unopened orange seals up the juice. And we kind of like that description of a city. But it's just that thing of having to discover and rediscover your own place helps you to start to be able to read another. So this is the city that we have grown out of. As Maneo says, this is our common ground, our beat, our place, which we've been working in for over 30 years. And our experience, partly because of the nature of the city, but also because of the nature of our practice, we've been very much stitching and repairing and practicing a process of addition rather than subtraction. This is a plan of the Temple Bar area where 8 practices came together in 1991, and one against the big corporate offices, a lesson for all young architects, that you can join forces and get somewhere. And we won this competition for the refurbishment of this whole cultural quarter, based on this idea of making public space 2 squares and one new street, but also on the thing of taking the existing grain and consolidating it rather than destroying it. One of our most public projects in Dublin in recent years has been the Department of Finance, which Klaus mentioned, which is at the junction of Merrion Row, quite an ordinary street, with St. Stephen's Green. But what we love about this image is I remember we were up on the roof of a building looking down on this square, on Merrion Square, and nothing as radical as this happens nowadays in terms of the wish to make such a wonderful public space, and for the wish to make a unified wall which makes the public space primary and the private space secondary. But we're on this cusp connecting government buildings through this tiny crack in the block, manifesting itself on, as I say, quite an ordinary street. And the tradition in Dublin is that the ordinary buildings of the street are made in brick, and the special buildings, this is a corner at the Newcomen Bank at the entrance to Dublin Castle, a beautiful, my favourite corner in Dublin, the way it turns the corner and makes a change in scale and expresses a different register in terms of public or private. And so we took this idea of making a stone building which finishes the brick block and starts to relate to St. Stephen's Green. It was a strange situation because even though it was the Department of Finance, it had no public room. And the public can't enter easily because everything that happens in the department is secret or private. And so the only thing we could use to make a public space was the staircase. And again, this often happens in Dublin, where you see a beautiful staircase winding its way or dancing its way across a facade through the windows of the brick block, in this case the stone block. So we made the staircase the public room, which protects the offices from noise and from direct south light. And then we use the normal Georgian threshold of the sunken area and the bridge and the gate to make this hopefully deal with the security issues but not feel unwelcoming. And just looking at that, the section that led to that elevation, ground being here, you entered this level, move up a staircase in the low building, and then start to cut across the facade and enter the different floors of offices. The building relates to a Huguenot cemetery, which is a really special sacred place in Dublin. And so there was a sensitivity about how offices would address this special space. And we suppressed the offices in favour of circulation and thought about the circulation being like a cloister with a rhythm of windows through which the civil servants could view the city. And we used the number of 50% solid, 50% glass, which is part of the thing that generates the architecture and the rhythm of buildings in Dublin. And we wanted to give this building a sense of weight and presence, and used solid limestone, self-supporting, it's not a cladding, it's an outer leaf, and use the depth of the windows and the different functions of the different windows to make this feel like a kind of vertical weave of stone and glass, and to make it feel like a screen as opposed to a glass wall overlooking the cemetery. So some of the windows are recessed and slide open and have vents which take air in, and some of the windows are flush with the stone and make a kind of bay window. So, and this building we looked at, which we found amazing when we were doing the Department of Finance in Dublin, we looked at this building by Celsing in Stockholm, and it has a kind of a prehistoric quality, even though it's a corporate building, it's a bank, and was built at a time when much different kinds of buildings within the, let's say, the international style were being built in Stockholm. And talking about new geography, I mean, this feels like a piece of geology, this wall, it feels like a piece of mountain. And that really stopped us in our tracks, to think that you could use this riven stone, which becomes finer and finer in terms of the way that the building is crafted and made, and that it reminds me of work written by Christian Norberg Schulz many years ago about genius loci and the relationship between the colour of a city and the colour of its mountains, or the nature of a city and the nature of the landscape around it. Milan, Klaus mentioned, we won in 2002. It's a university building, University of Economics, just outside the Spanish walls in Milan, about 25 minutes walk from the Duomo, at a point where 1 grain of city meets the looser, less dense grain of city. And I showed before the image of the roof of the Duomo, and again, it was interesting today listening to students talking about tradition and the connection between tradition and the moves that you make. And what we found was that this really helped us in thinking about making new ground or new territory, which this scale of project really was about, in that it was 65,000 square meters of building, much bigger than anything we had ever done before. Milan, a city with beautiful stone floors. Even the streets where the traffic and the trams run have this heavy stone paving. A city of quite hard exteriors. It's not like many of the typical Italian cities, because it has an Austro-Hungarian legacy, so it's much more solid and hard on the outside, and then you penetrate these courtyards and wonderful worlds in the interior. And of course, the making of a university in a city is an ongoing question. What is the role of a university, and what is the role of a university in the city? And we used the Il Broletto, which is this medieval market, couple of steps away from the Duomo, and thought that it would be fantastic to make a university which felt like a market of ideas and a place of exchange. But the main challenge of this project was that we were supposed to put 20,000 square meters of accommodation below ground, and the remainder above ground, because there was a height limit on the site. And the brief was for offices for 1,000 professors, and we literally took the idea of Sphere Fen and thought, well, imagine if we could make a roof, a sky world, which would allow light to penetrate down through these worlds of offices, and imagine if we could make offices feel like light filters. And then we thought about, as we mentioned I just showed in the Chilida image, that we would carve the ground and make a new landscape which would be continuous with the landscape of the city, but that this landscape would erupt and that it wouldn't keep in its place, that we wouldn't respect that datum that was suggested in the brief. So in some ways we broke the rules of the competition in order to hold these two worlds apart, because this is private and this is public, and by holding the two worlds apart, the wish was that the life of the city would enter into the university. And we looked a lot when we were making this project at the Utzon fantastic sketches of the Mayan platforms and the new ground made for the new geography made for the Sydney Opera House. And so we were thinking that we could think about the new ground that we make as being like something of that scale, that it would make a platform at the scale of the city, and that above that would hover a separate world, visually connected, but acoustically and physically separate. We thought about taking the stone floor of the city through the university. The carved spaces are the white spaces which go deep into the ground to take light down to 5 and 9 meters below ground, as well as this courtyard which goes to 9 meters below ground. The plan looks quite simple, where we separate out conference facilities, the main auditorium for 1,000 people, the professors' entrance, because they have their own private entrance, and the public functions. This is now a cafe. And we made a move which was to put the auditorium at the noisiest corner of the site, which in many ways doesn't make, it's not common sense, but we felt that it was the most public room and that it should occupy the most public corner. This is a street which is full of trams and traffic and noise, and this is the quiet street. And then the sketches that we made of what this would be like if we used a structure similar to the Lina Bobardi structure. In our case, it's not an 80-meter span, it's a 25-meter span. And we use these double diaphragm walls, which are in fact the primary corridors at the office level, and made this labyrinthine world which would deal with the whole thing of the offices for the professors, and at the same time make the voids which would let the light penetrate deep into the project. We were interested in making an undulating soffit, that the world of the conference below would not be separated from the world of the professors above. And in order to, because I suppose in a sense, cities are about coming together, about having privacy, but at the same time of having the pleasure of enjoying the world of the city. And the structure we used, I'll explain in a moment. But one of the things that was very interesting about working with Klaus Bode and his secret firm, which I will have to mention before the end of the evening or I'll be shocked probably, was fantastic working with Klaus and his team, was that he was able to, these courtyards didn't satisfy any category in Milan. It wasn't a courtyard under their law, it wasn't a light well under their codes, it wasn't a garden under their codes. It had, it was nothing. So the way that we got permission for this project was through the passion and the scientific analysis of this team, proving to the Comune and to the building regulations people that this would make a fantastic environment in terms of natural light and in terms of making spaces appropriate for working. And at competition stage, there was this whole thing of working out how we could make, I suppose, a solid edge, which we had in some ways thought about in response to the nature of the city, that Milan does have hard interiors and soft interiors, but also environmentally it started to make sense, because facing south and west, that we would make a more solid enclosure, and within this we could make a microclimate which wouldn't have the problems of exposure of a more open building. And so at competition stage, each of the surfaces was thought about in terms of light and shade and glare and solar gain, and there was a whole discussion about glass and layers of glass and how much of the surface needed to be solid, how much could be open, and how could we get that balance between environmental protection and the control of natural light. And of course all the office bars are quite shallow and allow us to make cross-ventilated buildings. But this diagram is really to do with the idea, the breakthrough that we had in terms of structure, that because we wanted to make this connection between the public world and the private, we didn't want a transfer structure or a separating structure at this point. So the primary structure is to the roof. It's supported on huge columns and on the diaphragm walls, which are corridors. And then we hung the floors of the offices, and so we were able to manipulate the soffit. So we make decisions. We're interested in structure, but not in terms of heroics, but in terms of how structure and space can work together. So we could get this undulating soffit and this sense of connection between the more private world of the professors and the public world of the university, and then still let the city, this is the city level, let the city move through. Milan is a very misty, foggy city. This was actually one of our snapshots taken when we came to do the competition. We were very disappointed. We thought we were going to be in a very glamorous part of the fashion kind of district, and we found ourselves in this kind of grotty street with these funny kind of grotty buildings and this misty day where you actually couldn't tell the time of day. It was so misty, very strange, dreamy kind of atmosphere. But what was really interesting was seeing the site in that context, because it made us think about it in a very particular kind of way. And we were really convinced that this corner was hugely important, not in terms of its beauty, but in terms of its presence in the city. And that if we wanted the university to express its presence in the city, that we really need to occupy this corner. So by placing the auditorium, the main Aula Magna, on the corner, and by expressing it and allowing it to erupt, as we talked about in that diagram, that we could let the life of the city down into the world below, and we could use the offices above as kind of periscopes to take light into this public space. So this was our competition study, the wish to make a building which would allow the passerby on the tram on a misty evening in Milan to see something happening in the foyer, which is 5 meters below ground, and to engage somehow with that there would be an engagement between the university and the city. We felt this corner was too busy to make a doorway, so we made what we called a window to Milan, and held back on made a public space to make the sequence of entry. So this is the carved ground of courts and cuts, which take light deep down into the conference spaces. And we used the one element other than the auditorium, which wasn't offices, which was to be meeting rooms and library space, as a kind of shield between the city and the inner world. And then gradually built up this kind of labyrinth of offices coming to the solid structure of the roof from which the offices hang. And then the final composition. We're very much aware of the Luigi Moretti building on Corso Italia, which has this big kind of nose which cantilevers out over the street. And in a sense, we were kind of caught between the campus of Bocconi has fantastic rationalist buildings by Pagano and Muzio, and for weeks and weeks and weeks we were trying to continue in that kind of tradition, but we took courage from the Moretti building in the more expressive release of the volumes within to become the form without. And the idea of this form came from the wish the university had to have the auditorium in 2 zones. Originally they were going to have them closing off, one from the other, 400 and 600. And so from this form we made this cantilevering out over the street, and this being the main foyer 5 meters below street level. And these are the periscopes, because we felt that while it was for conference, that there should be daylight, and in the way that Alvar Aalto always takes daylight into lecture theatres, we feel convinced that it's not always necessary to make performance or lecture spaces completely solid. In terms of the structure, this is the idea of the diaphragm walls, which are, as I say, are the primary circulation. Each one is different because while we have a rigor in one direction, the grid is irregular in the other direction. And so this makes for diversity, and also was to do with the manipulation of the position of voids relative to what was happening below. So we were trying to make this kind of infrastructure, I suppose because, again, this was 170 metres by 70 metres. We felt we were working at the scale of infrastructure, not just the scale of building, but of inhabited infrastructure. And we're very interested in that getting beyond the terminology of the building, but thinking about it either as new territory or new ground or inhabited infrastructure. And we were very excited by these double walls marching down the site, and then these beams came along, and from the beams hung the office space. And in terms of the language of the building, we made this very hard exterior crust, and then a much lighter interior, which would reflect light within the tiny courtyards, making a double layer of what we call glass shingles, which hang from the roof and deal with issues of privacy, professor to professor, and deal with issues of glare. And by contrast, the stone that we used on the exterior is local to Milan. And we had won the competition about 2 weeks, and the client said, "What stone do you want to use?" And that's kind of a shocking question when you really don't know. And we just mentioned that we had seen this beautiful stone on Via Brera. So they took out a book, and we had to find the stone, and we said, "Is that one?" And they said, "Yeah, but that's a really cheap stone. You know you're in Italy now. We have beautiful stone here." And we said, "Yeah, we know, but we've never seen one like this." Yvonne calls it geological concrete, and they still in Italy, I think very few countries you're allowed to do it anymore, but the stone is fixed directly to the concrete with a combination of dowels and fixative. So it means that the joints could be between 1 and 3 millimeters thick, which means that it doesn't feel like cladding, that it has that monolithic quality. And the street is strange because you don't really notice the building as you approach it in one way. In one direction you can see the tram and the issue of the noise in relation to the auditorium. So the building reveals itself gradually as you approach it in this direction, but then has a completely different presence in terms of how it turns the corner and how this auditorium rises out of the ground in order to give expression to this public space. In terms of the way of making these hard exteriors, these meeting rooms and library spaces get their light from within and just have cracks of light, and the form comes from, it was the one place where we felt we could make double height spaces, that we could break away from the tyranny of the office floor, and so we expressed the double height space on the street and made this kind of three-dimensional screen, which by contrast then with this 8-meter high glass wall, which allows the life of the city into the public life of the university. And this sense of the offices floating above the stone floor of the entrance courtyard. We didn't use the stone of Milan because for many, many reasons we couldn't do that, but we used the same stone on the floor of the courtyards and all of the ground level as used on the elevation. And we made these deep cuts, these deep staircases with these handrails, which are balustrades, which are structural, so that there are big moves within the scale of the university for legibility, and also to take light down and to bring that sense of the university coming deep down into the conference level. And by contrast, the professor's stairs feels like it's slung in the space. So some of the stairs are carved out of the ground, and this stairs feels like it's hanging in what we call a nave space, which is the main circulation space for the professors. And this is the stepped courtyard, which this is 9 meters below ground, 5 meters, and the city is carrying on above. When we went below ground to 5 meters and 9 meters below ground, we used a different stone to reflect light. And also, I suppose, because this was the most public level, 5 meters below ground. So this is a white Bianca Lazza marble. And because of the scale of the spaces, which were really residual spaces, nobody, especially the client, didn't expect these spaces to be so grand. And now they use it for exhibition. So they have what they call the Bocconi Art Gallery. When we won the competition, we actually had 2 columns here because we were scared that we couldn't cantilever 21 meters. And one of the interesting things was when we met our local engineer, he said, we have to take these away. If we put 2 columns in here, everybody in Milan will be laughing at me. So it was that was kind of refreshing. It was a good start. He was probably the rudest, most arrogant person I've ever worked with, but he was worth it because he removed those columns, and he was a great engineer. But what's lovely about this image is that the way that the life of the city is actually stronger in the space than we imagined, because you get all these buildings engaging with the public. So when you're here, you really are aware of these buildings to the degree that at a certain point, the client was worried that we might need a huge curtain, which really was a daunting task. They're afraid that somebody might shoot Berlusconi from up here or whatever, because it really is obvious to the city, and the city enters in, which was exactly, of course, what we wanted. And this image, I suppose, gives a sense of the infrastructural quality of the project, the entrance level, which is like a bridge, bridging over the 5 meter below ground, which is with this 25 meter span, and 9 meters below ground, and these are the economists partying in the stepped garden and in the foyer spaces. And what's interesting about the structural strategy and the strategy to do with courtyards and voids is that in a sense, we were designing this building not in a fixed compositional way. It's like one thing was as a result of the other, and we really enjoyed that freedom, that there were new views which opened up which we didn't expect in terms of the diagonal. And there's always this continuous connection between a raised courtyard space and an indoor space and an outdoor space, and you're all the time weaving your way between inside and outside. The only interior we designed in this project was the auditorium. Every other part of the building, the structure is the interior, more or less. But here it's lined, and we made these 3 periscopes. They're not quite as gold in reality, but that was the wish. And the light, the daylight does penetrate the conference room, which is a real pleasure. These wonderful seats were designed by a Milanese architect with whom we collaborated, much more chic than we might probably ever achieve, but it's about as chic as you can get. At Christmas, the year after we finished this building, we got this photograph from one of the economists, and we were really pleased because you can see it's a wet evening in Milan. And there's a party in that space, which is, I suppose, for us one of the key, our favourite space in the building. But just that thing of the city engaging with the interior life of the building. And Yvonne always jokes that we've managed to make a space that make economists dance, and that's a kind of achievement. So they have these dancers on stilts in a circle under this cantilever. And it has that kind of theatrical quality, which really pleased us. The next project I'm going to show is we love this map, the kind of broken heart of Toulouse. with the big river, the Garonne, and the Midi Canal comes into the Garonne. And this was a completely different challenge to working in Milan. We came to Milan with a strategy and with a sense of familiarity about how one deals with an orthogonal urban block, even though the challenge in Milan was to find a language appropriate to that city and appropriate to the materiality of the city. In Toulouse, it's much more picturesque, one might say in inverted commas, beautiful city, red brick city with beautiful bridges, churches, towers, skyline, undercroft of bridges. And we were really struggling initially because one is always trying to find clues, and in terms of how territory is staked out in different places or different cities. And we were looking at these buttresses and these wonderful walls of the churches. This is actually the end of a facade, which is like a piece of scenery. It's about 15 meters wide, and this shallow makes the facade of a church. And then by contrast, there's towers, and there are these tiny courtyards, which I spoke about. And there's places like the Jacobin, which is probably one of the most memorable spaces that I visited, and is it does what Laurent Boudouin talks about. It makes you really feel that architecture is a machine for slowing time down. So it was very sobering, challenging place to think about working. And this image, this photograph we took on our first visit to the Jacobin in the cloistered space, and we loved the fact that this child went and stood in the sunshine like a spotlight, and the observing of the layers of wall, of cloister, of cloistered space, of archway, but no windows. And again, that came up today. How you can make a series of layers which protect space, and sometimes you need glass and sometimes you don't need glass. And so we became very aware of the very different climate of Toulouse, very different to Milan. Milan was foggy, polluted, no wind. We had a client who wasn't particularly interested in natural ventilation. They really just cared about how the building looked. So any achievements that we managed in Milan came from us, really. It was our agenda to make offices where you could open windows and have mixed mode ventilation and reduce the amount of the number of spaces which were air conditioned. Toulouse is windy. It's not polluted. It's much hotter in the summer. No, it's probably not much hotter in the summer, but it's not so cold in the winter, and it doesn't have the problem of fog and humidity. In terms of the site, it was at a confluence of the university and the Garonne, and where the Midi Canal. This is a branch of the Midi Canal, which is the Brienne, hitting the Garonne. So very difficult shape of site to deal with in any kind of rational way. And it has all these strata of canal, of towpath, of street, of buildings. So it's very much to do with the series of layers from water to sky. We looked at the elements we had found in Toulouse of the buttresses, and again we were sort of talking about this today, about how you make office space and at the same time not make glass buildings. We were determined that we would offer a solid edge to the city, even though we had to deal with the repetitive function of office. And it took us quite some time to work out how we would do that. And in the end, we made a very simple move, which is to think about fire escape stairs as being like huge columns. And they would make these big feet which would stake out the territory at the edges of the project. And then that we would cut out of that in order to make spaces for light. Because of the nature of the site, it moves from quite an organic plan on the lower level to a much more rational plan at the upper level. And before we knew what to do, we were thinking again about about buildings to do with education. And the key thing in any educational building is that space you make between the void, as Alejandro de la Sota calls it, the space between the given functions. So there was a wish to make something which was continuous. There was a wish to use buttresses to make a very dense environment which would control the environment. And at some point Yvonne was drawing sunflowers. We were on the train from Toulouse to Carcassonne, and the fields were full of sunflowers. And there are certain moments when you worry about your partner, and at a certain moment I was getting worried, thinking this is going to be trouble. But I suppose it's the making of buildings is you're searching and you're working from intuition, you're working from precise analysis, but you're also working from intuition. The sketch, in a way, describes the project where we put all the offices in the background. Again, going back to Santiago de Compostela, what's in the background, what's in the foreground. And we stacked all the conference rooms towards the river and towards the city, and made gaps between these conference rooms to make big windows at the scale of the city, so that these professors could look past this wall, this red brick wall, through to the world of the city, and that we would make this a public space which would be the heart and the core of the university within these. So we were very conscious of these big brick feet and buttresses which exist throughout the city, and we're really using, in a sense, designing a building almost through a collage of the elements that we had found, and trying to integrate these physical elements into the way that we would make a building. And the result is this kind of plan. I forgot to mention that we're also, which is no joke, taking our place in the breach in a 5-meter beautiful medieval brick wall. And this is where the wall is broken. And that's the frontage of our project. So we tried to make the public rooms of the project relate to the public world of the city, and that the offices would be more background spaces, working from the more organic ground levels. The building is exhaling and inhaling, dealing with the conditions around it. It works around the lift shafts and the central courtyard as the kind of heart of the project, building up to the more rational roof level where the offices span over the organic world of the conferences below. And these are what we call the buttresses, the escapes there. And each of the facades is thought about in the context of the conditions around it, and also in terms of control, in terms of light and solar gain. We made this threshold space, which is a forecourt, that threshold between the city and the interior world of the university. And there's a term that David Leatherbarrow uses when he's talking about edges and thresholds, and he talks about the manipulation of light and shade has social significance. And we find that really interesting, that instead of thinking about elevations, that one thinks about how the climate might change as you're walking past a wall. I mean, in a hot country it might be that there's shade, in a cold country it might be that there's sun, but that instead of always thinking about elevations in a kind of abstract way, to actually think about what the implications of the way that you make those edges and thresholds are in terms of environmental, but also in terms of social implications. So we've made this threshold, which is the threshold between the city and the university, and that is open to the sky, in framing the window to the sky in the same way as the courtyards of Toulouse as we found them. And then there was the whole issue that we were making all of the spaces external, as much of the space external as possible, because that's what we found in Toulouse. You would go into a courtyard, you would go up an external staircase, you would finally come to a room, come to a door, and go inside. But that experience was delayed, the thing of outside to inside. And these were the studies that Klaus and his team did because our client kept saying, yes, but Toulouse is windy, and you're going to give us a central foyer space, and we want to be able to use that in the wintertime. So there was a lot of work done to do with making sure that this central microclimate, which is protected from wind and rain, that it would actually work when there are really high winds in Toulouse. I mean, surprisingly high winds which whip up the river. And as I mentioned, we wanted to make facades which had a richness, the kind of richness that the facades of Toulouse had, but we also started to make these work in terms of the modulation of those facades. And what we enjoy is working with a team of people who engage with you in actually scientifically mapping and making efficient the things you're trying to do. So these are all the external spaces, which are the ones that operate between our blocks, and this thing of the crust and the different ways and layers of space that we're making between outside and inside. And then each of these has its own implication in terms of conditioning, whether it's completely open, whether it's partly conditioned, whether it's fully conditioned, so that that's mapped and worked with as we move through the design. This is what we call a sky cloister, which connects some of the public, the professor, the president, across to the social spaces of the professors, and under this kind of archway is the entrance to the heart of the project, which is this external courtyard. It's the first time that we've pushed this idea of pushing insofar as possible the line between outside and inside, and really trying to see how we could make protected outdoor space, because that was the beauty of the city, that you were moving always through courtyards and cloisters. Obviously the building has to be protected, so there's, as always, issues of security, but one tries to deal with security without being defensive. So this is the forecourt space into the central space. This is one level below ground. The conference rooms with these terraces, they have what they call cocktail areas, which sounds really civilized. So each lecture theatre has a cocktail area and a terrace. So the suites of the public rooms relate to the canal and relate to the river. And as you can see, each of the facades is modulated to do with its orientation and to do with the conditions of the city around it. And that leads to a space like this, which is protected and is a microclimate. Make these big windows so you see between rooms through the terraces to the city, so that while you're making this important world for the university, you're also choreographing the connections. And because all the escape stairs are pushed to the edge, we can circulate freely around the central space with bridges and staircases. And this is what we call the internal landscape of the project sketches we were doing at competition stage, to try and get this sense of an internal landscape meeting the external landscape of the city. So there's this Romanesque church, the stepped ramp into this central courtyard, the sky cloister, the window to the sky, and these terraces and bridges, and this lower level which deals with some of the smaller conference spaces. The bridge from the conference rooms to the more enclosed spaces for the professors, it's exactly the same brief as and you bypass a raised garden. It's exactly the same brief as Bocconi, but about 10 times smaller. So it's offices for professors with conferences. And we used this tourist poster, which we found at competition stage, to look at this strata and try to see how we could make a building which would stitch into this wonderful array of beautiful brick walls. This is where the Brienne Canal comes into the Garonne. And then in terms of construction, our medieval wall, which has been repaired so many times, but has this beautiful patina of mortar and brick. And we found about 1 hour outside of Toulouse a brick factory which makes bricks exactly the same size and same variety of colour as this brick. We won't be able to get this richness of surface, I don't think, but the wish is to make a wall which has a sense of connecting with this wall, because we're just something like 300 millimeters, 400 millimeters, our building will be abutting this medieval brick wall. In terms of the fire escape stairs, we had to have a certain proportion of opening to allow for the air movement and air extract, and that was a real challenge to make this, to hold the solidity of, this was a small news house we did in Dublin many years ago where we used this perforated brick for reasons of privacy, but here we're using it in the staircases to allow the smoke to be taken out, and also to try to make fire stairs pleasurable, because you find inevitably that a fire stairs gets used every day by the office worker to nip up and down, and sometimes we're kind of embarrassed by fire stairs because they're so horrible and they become used by people. And this was we were amazed when we went to the brick factory how the diversity of brick that one could get. It's exactly the same size mold as the medieval wall. It's I think it's 42 millimeters by 26, and then you can have bricks with holes in the middle, or you can cut them long ways or short ways. So there's this whole array of possibilities in terms of how we use this brick, and we had to use a very simple idea of a perforated wall, had to be highly engineered to deal with current codes. So we use these hollow bricks which are reinforced, and really worked to get the air extract required, and at the same time maintain the solidity of the buttress. We had a lot of arguments about how the building should hit the ground. And then we went to, there are many examples in Toulouse of brick walls just coming straight to the ground. But anybody who's done that detail knows there's always a worry about moisture and staining and all that kind of thing. And then we went to Albi, which is 1 hour from, everything seems to be 1 hour from Toulouse or Milan. But it's this wonderful defensive cathedral built in Albi, and was visited by Louis Kahn and drawn by Louis Kahn. And you can see the impact of this building on the work of Louis Kahn, especially when you look at My Architect and look at some of that film and look at some of the brick walls. Stunning building, absolutely amazing, changes your view of brick forever. Am I okay on time? Yeah. Then the third project I'm going to show is the project in Lima. It's an engineering university. It's located in this finger which comes in from the sea. It's this distance away from the old city, and as I mentioned, it's a kind of place we've never been to before, with this separation of the sea from the city. This amazing cliff, which has this monumental presence overlooking the Pacific Ocean, a city of 8 or 9 million people with virtually no public transport, a throbbing city full of lots of problems and lots of treasures. We thought we knew about fog in Milan until we went to Lima. And Lima is absolutely extraordinary because, and one of the students was talking today about, I think it was Mumbai, being under cloud so many days of the year. Lima has this blanket of fog for a huge percentage of the year. And it's so strange, it's kind of surreal, because you're standing down at the beach and you're looking up at the city, and then you look up again and the city is gone. It's completely disappeared. So it's like there's two parallel worlds, one beside the other. We probably wouldn't have had the nerve or the confidence to do this competition if we hadn't already been, I would say, emotionally involved with the work of particularly Brazilian architects, Vila Nova Artigas and Villanueva. Probably in 1999 we discovered this work, and it very much influenced Bocconi. You can see in the structure, this whole thing of the sense of structure, which is also infrastructure. the weaving of interior and exterior spaces, that whole fluidity that climate and culture permits. And that was something that when we applied to get on the shortlist to do that competition, I suppose in a sense this certain level of engagement previous to the competition gave us some courage. Because of the conditions of the site and the nature of the project, we looked at quite diverse projects ranging from Le Corbusier's projects in Algiers and also in Rio de Janeiro. And the reason for doing this was because we were dealing with a site which was 300 meters long and really did have that sense, or needs to have that sense of inhabited infrastructure. We also looked at very particular projects like Niamh Brown's Alexandra Road many years ago, which we used to go to see, and Niamh Brown would sometimes teach us and do reviews. And this housing backs onto a railway line, and so it offers this hard shoulder to the railway line. But on the other hand, it has this very intimate, humane world of housing. And we were also looking at Eduardo Soto de Mora's football stadium, as well as looking at Mendes de Rocha, which is work that we later presented in the Venice Biennale. And the reason for us starting to think about football stadiums was because of the nature of the site. This is the site which is, as I say, 300 meters long. But it's in a situation where it has this incredibly fast motorway on the one hand, like Niamh Brown's railway line, and it has this beautiful old district called Barranco, which is high-density, low-rise housing. So we're on this kind of extreme collision of two conditions, you could say. The very nice thing was that this site addresses this green finger of space, which has this tiny window to the Pacific Ocean. So the first sketches were to do with this thing of the cliff and making something which, because we were in this valley which connected to the cliff, that perhaps we could make something which felt like a new piece of cliff or had some resonance with this piece of geography, and making this space which would make a hard shoulder to the heavy roadway and make a series of cascading gardens which would relate to Barranco. This is the scale of the project we're doing and the scale of the valley and how it comes down to the sea. The ideas, or the concept model made at competition stage, this paper model, was related to this idea of how we could make a piece of infrastructure and how we could sling these teaching spaces in that structure in order to make a perfect, quiet, humane, intimate environment as you recede from the motorway, and in order to make these cascading gardens overlooking Barranco. And this was the idea of the structure, that we would make a solid foothold in the ground because it's seismic, so that all the bigger spaces are placed lower in section, reducing to the smaller teaching spaces and library on the top floor, so that there would be a sense of stability in terms of the way that the building hit the ground. And we had a very interesting team. We worked with a young Spanish engineer in Dublin, and we worked with Klaus and his team in the making of the competition entry. There's 9 millimeters of rain in Lima per year, except every couple of years this, I don't know how much of a deluge it is, but it comes, and it's called El Niño. And this was a sketch that Yvonne did of the building being able to deal with when there's a lot of water, as well as dealing with no water. And this idea of this new piece of geography being able to deal with gardens and sunshine and water. And all the drawings we made at competition stage were these buildings disappearing into the fog. One of our team had lived in Lima, and she knew the city very well, which was fantastic because we had never been. And so there was a lot of discussion about fog and about how buildings recede into the sky, and how people if we blurred these boundaries between inside and outside, what the social implications of this would be and what the implications would be for the life of the university. So in this project, developing on from Toulouse, all of the circulation is external, except for the actual teaching spaces. So like a football stadium, everybody moves along these staircases and galleries and then goes to these teaching spaces which relate to gardens behind. Our client, as well as being a mining engineering company, they're also a concrete production company, and so we're hopefully in the next couple of months starting to think about what kind of concrete we will make and how we can make connections between the surface and the colour of the concrete and the cliff. And by contrast, the cascading gardens overlooking Barranco, and that sense of how the teaching spaces would relate to gardens and overlook the big city. And this was our competition section, which is basically like the sketch section. We used the conference rooms as spaces to be buried and to make this protective base or plinth or wall to the motorway, and then the spaces get lighter as you move up through the building. Then we discovered there was a problem of noise from the motorway, and so there was a whole redesign issue in terms of how we could place more rooms to the motorway in order to make the public space of the building comfortable in terms of people having conversations. And parallel with that, there were all the studies to do with daylight and to do with the levels of daylight when there's heavy cloud cover, because I suppose the worry was that the building naturally gives shading because this is north, so it provides shading by virtue of its staggering. But the worry was that because of the need for more building on the face, that the natural daylight would be too gloomy on cloudy, foggy days. So again, as in the other projects, this kind of mapping and scientific study happens in parallel with the architectural decisions. Our ground floor plan, where the building is embedded in the ground with this heavy wall making a protection to the motorway, and then it gets lighter and lighter as it moves up through the section with these gardens and terraces, and makes very dramatic circulation spaces which will enjoy a view of the sea, and has this infrastructural quality in terms of how it addresses the motorway, by contrast with the softer edge to Barranco. And the sense of entry as you come from Barranco in through the building up to the circulation spaces, we used the laboratories like exhibition spaces. So the idea is that we wouldn't hide these away, but that they would be visible, because that's the core of the school. And so that these would be visible to the visitor and to the student, so that the core research in the school would be obvious. These are our study models made for ourselves and also for the Venice Biennale. And I'm just showing you this because we saw these images before we went to Lima, and these constructs are called huacas. And we had never seen anything like these before, and just found them amazing in terms of how space can be kind of woven, that there are these monuments and sacred sites which are made out of tiny bricks to make artificial mountains and to make these sacred special spaces. So this was, I'm just showing this out of interest. It's not something we have managed to absorb into our work, but it's something that's there that we really want to investigate. But what did help, because we are very cautious about working in places outside of our own place, in the sense that there's a fear of being arrogant or of making an intervention which is inappropriate to the culture and tradition of that place. And we were looking at Machu Picchu, as anybody who knows anything about Peru would do, partly to do with the whole idea of terracing. And while we were looking at this, we discovered the similarity between that and Skellig Mill, which is the monastic settlement off the coast of Ireland, similar mountain in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, similar rock, and this rock in the middle of the Andes. And that made us feel that in the end, we do share humanity. We do share that sense of the need for intimacy and protection within a huge landscape, just like these monks with their tiny little gardens. And what's wonderful is when you visit this rock, you get the sense of the monk tending to the garden within the huge landscape of the ocean. And so that's something we're very concerned about in this project in Lima, that there, in terms of the students and the teaching spaces, that there will be that sense of intimacy within the huge landscape of the city. I'll just finish with the Venice Biennale, where we were invited to take part in the Common Ground exhibition, and we discovered when we were really struggling to see what we would do, well, we knew the first thing we would do would be to think about collaborating with Paulo Mendes de Rocha. In his letter of invitation, David Chipperfield suggested and encouraged collaboration, and suggested that one could collaborate with a stranger from afar, but perhaps somebody whose work you had inspired you. And we immediately thought of Sao Paulo and of Mendes de Rocha, and we discovered that his football stadium, which was one of the first images we'd ever seen of his work, was the same length, half of the stadium is the same length as our project. So there was this idea of an arena for learning and a football stadium, and we kind of enjoyed the liberation of the switching of these typologies, that between that we could, those two projects, we could develop a sense of common ground. This sketch is to do with Venice on piles as opposed to the eruptions of these rocks of Skellig Mill and Machu Picchu. So what we enjoyed in the Venice Biennale was taking the work of another architect and trying to analyze it in a fresh way, which would communicate both to ourselves and to others why it was that this space in particular we found so memorable. This is the first image of any work of Paulo Mendes de Rocha that I saw, and found it really haunting because of its robust kind of quality, because it's shadowy and it's mysterious, it's rough, and then you discover that it's the public space that's coming in under this amazing stadium, which relates to the football pitch. And what we found in trying to express the monumentality of this quite horizontal element was that we had to pull it apart and fragment it. So we made the one model at a scale of 1 to 20 to get the sense of how this is the duality of the project, where it opens out to the openness of the pitch, the structure grows out of the ground, and it makes this undercroft which is quite solid when you approach it from the city. And so the fragmentation and the pulling apart of his project in order to really express it meant that we then started to think about fragments and ruins in terms of our own project. And we made these in papier-mâché, a technique which we learned from an Irish sculptor. And we fragmented our own project to try to understand it in the same way, about the thing of the cascading terraces, how the structure would grow out of the ground, how it might develop and change, how the staircases would cling to the walls and to the surfaces of the structure. And again, I suppose that a lot of Louis Kahn's models, early models, are fantastic because they have a very deep base and sometimes a tiny model. And that really gives a sense of projects being grounded, which is something that we're really interested in. And I suppose there's also an interest in fragments and ruins, that perhaps buildings shouldn't always feel finished, but also that fragments and ruins allow the imagination to enter in. And we were at a stage where this was a very young project. It wasn't at a stage where we could make a big model. So the thing of pulling it apart and dealing with it in fragments was wonderful. We also made some stone models. Paulo Mendes de Rocha was very keen that we would present a really simple but really fantastic urban proposal which he has made for Montevideo, which was made over a student summer workshop or something, where the idea was to turn the city towards the water. It was inspired by Venice because this is a really shallow bay. It's only about 2.5 meters deep. And that it would have, given that it was inspired by Venice, that we would present it. So we made the stone model, limestone and polished limestone to express the water, and he made, out of this rock which existed, the idea was that there would be a theatre which would be at the scale of the city. And then, of course, when we made Paulo Mendes de Rocha's model in stone, we decided we'd make a stone model of Lima, which is the Pacific Ocean, the beach, the cliffs, the valley, and the wish that our project would rise out of this valley like a piece of this cliff. And looking at comparative landscape traditions has been, again, a parallel research that we've been doing for Venice, but also in the development of our own project, this tiny little country of Ireland with this tiny Skellig Mill on the Atlantic and the Machu Picchu in the middle of the Andes. But again, this whole tradition of, in both of these places, of how, as human beings, we cling to the rock for safety, for security, for intimacy, in order to for survival, and how spaces and places are made from the distant past, and how that can filter into contemporary work. I think it's, well, I know it is. T.S. Eliot is an essay which I love of his called Tradition and the Individual Talent. And he says that art never improves, it's just the materials change or slightly change. He also says that tradition is not inherited, that it must be earned through much labour. But this image we like because of the different scales of happening parallel, of study model, developed model, fragments, and that blending into the landscape of Skellig Mill in the background. So it is that thing of history and time and tradition and geography and how buildings can stitch into place and into the earth in a way of making new pieces of geography. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. What I would like to do is I know it's a bit late, but I'd like to open the floor for a few questions, if I may. I have one, but unless somebody else has, because it's your turn, then I'll skip mine. We've got a hand coming up. Yes. The gentleman over there.
Oh, it's fine. Yeah. I'm from Milan, and the first time I see the building, I say, oh, wow, finally we have a real contemporary Milanese building.
Master, you need to speak on the microphone because we are recording, so to go online.
But only if it's a nice question.
No, so the first time I see the building, I was very happy because I think it represents very well contemporary Milanese building, but now I understand why, because this extremely capacity you have to understand the city where you design. So, for example, in Milan, the fact to understand that the buildings outside they are more made of stone and closed, and inside there is a bright and light world, like a secret world. So also the use of the stone that in architects in Milan love it. We call it ceppo, and I don't know why, but it's very Milanese and we love it. So the question is, when you have to explore a new city, what's the first thing you try to do to find out that sort of language, or sort of the sort of thing that comes out from the city, from the material, from the feeling? I mean, it's not easy. It's something that you really have to feel and understand. So what the first step, especially if it's a new city that maybe you don't know?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I don't know if it's linear, and I don't know if there's a first step and a final step. I suppose I I know that in Milan we came with some strategies literally in our pockets in terms of how one might deal with an urban block of that scale. And then I think mapping and reading a city is a combination of intuition and the subjective as well as the objective. I think very often as architects we're overtrained in terms of making analytical plans or strategies or thinking in 2 dimensions or something, maybe not in 3 dimensions, but maybe we have to think in 4 and 5 and 6 dimensions, where we have to think about the sound of a city and the floor of a city and literally, I suppose, feel the city, that it's a combination of analysis and responding, that you allow yourself to become aware of the nature of a place. There's a form of singing in Ireland which is called Sean Nos, and which means old time. And the people who sing that say that you can't sing it unless the song, unless you make the song your own, unless you become a filter for the song. So in a sense, as architects, we have to develop highly tuned senses to be able to see and absorb and let the city get under your skin and then think about it and then think about how one responds. So, and actually it's very interesting, that's the way that T.S. Eliot talks about the making of poetry in that essay. He talks about the poet being a channel for the poetry, and that poetry is not about personality, that it's about something else completely. So it's a bit vague maybe, but I think that it is seeing something and saying, my God, that's beautiful, or seeing something and saying, I've never seen that before. And like we found the stone floor of the city really strange because the pavements were concrete but the roads were stone and the trams ran over the stone, and it was a reversal of the norm, and it gave many parts of Milan are quite ugly, you could say, and many parts are really beautiful. It's a city I absolutely love, and I've learned more from that city than I would say any other city. And actually there's a wonderful essay in the Venice Biennale Reader by Fulvio Irace on the reconstruction of Milan after the war. And he actually makes the case, which is something for you to think about coming from Milan. He says that a city is made by architects and that the community of architects can make a city, which is quite a controversial thing to say because we're always saying the city is made by the context. I mean, it's a different condition because it's about rebuilding Milan after the war. But I think we've learned so much from Milan just simply by having to look at it in such an incisive way, because you don't look at a city like a tourist. If you have to make something in it, it's terrifying because you don't know what to do. And so you have to look at it very carefully, like a detective or something, and find clues both at the scale of a threshold, like the way that you make the dips in the pavement for the wheelchair access is beautiful. It's not like those horrible things we do in Dublin. It's just curved white stone. And there are small things as well as big things, because you can't always think big. You know, you have to find the small things parallel with the strategic clues. So I would say it came from looking and from being subjective and just saying, we think this is great, we'd like to use it. And the Ceppo we thought was again, because we'd never seen it before. And there's another stone in Milan which is called Beola, which is very like the Celsing stone, but not the same colour. And that was really strange because it was so rough. It was, again, like a piece of geology or something. We were kind of scared to use that. But the Ceppo we felt we could work with. And a really strange thing happened was when we found the picture in the book and said to the client, we think this stone is interesting, we went off to the quarry the following day, and then they bought the mountain to build the building, like about a couple of weeks later. And that makes you feel very responsible as well, because you're bringing a piece of a mountain into a city, so you have to use it responsibly, because you're taking geography from one place and you're building it in another. So there is that thing of how we use materials and how we use resources, and that we use them well and don't kill them by virtue of destroying the integrity of the material, which so often happens with beautiful materials which have no integrity because of the way architects use them. Is that? Yeah.
Do we have any other questions? I have a question then. Give anybody some time to think. Something that I always enjoyed about working with you which is over the years I see disappearing more and more working with certain architectural practices, is that you work so much with physical models. And a lot of what you showed here, the digital media plays not even secondary but a tertiary role, comes in quite late. It's very much hands-on, the materials, the quality of these spaces, and unlike what you see often with the razzmatazz of generated images on computer and through the digital age. And we see that a lot also, how things are changing also at the Architectural Association, where the digital age is taking a stronger and stronger foothold. Do you believe that to be able to reach those craftsman quality, or I actually often describe your architecture as a really craftsman's work or craftsman work, incredible, can only really be realized by maintaining a close affinity to physical modeling and trying, and I know how many models you generate through section models, which is wonderful, and therefore can digital age really replace this or not?
I mean, we don't believe in the image on its own. It's a tool which is a fantastic tool, but buildings are never like that. And there's a whole, I suppose that's why we use parallel tools. We've a great team of people in our office, ranging from the guy who makes the card models, and he's like a jeweler the way he makes models, and then we parallel with that we've got somebody who works on digital images, and that's always shocking, and we're always afraid to look at them because there's no mystery, and you have to be very careful about how you control these things, because a project has to grow. So I think we believe in the, not just in terms of craft, but in terms of developing the integrity of a project, in terms of its spatial presence, its physical presence, and just to understand it. We need to draw, we make sketches, we make models, we make rough models, we make presentation models, and parallel with that, it is extremely useful, the digital medium, but not on its own. And sometimes like we gave a lecture in Lima last week, and there's one image which is too literal, which I don't like, but it's in the public domain now. And it tends to be the image that always gets used. And somebody held it up and said, you know, I live in Barranco and you're going to build this heap of, you know, whatever, beside us. And so there was a whole discussion about the image. Buildings are much more complex than that. Mm-hmm. So in thinking about them and in experiencing them. And so I think as a singular tool, it's disastrous. As one of the tools, it's liberating and it's wonderful. But only as one of the many tools, I think.
Right.
I have a question. Where's the microphone?
Shelley, thanks. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. My question is a little bit about the process and also the concept stage of your project. All the projects that you showed us here, you showed a bit of the beginning, the first thinking, and apart from Lima, you know, the final building. And it's amazing how loyal the building is to your first ideas. And we know this is very difficult to achieve. I mean, Klaus can testify that any practicing architect or engineer, how much the design or ideas have to change as the project evolves. You said the project has evolved. It evolves, but it's really a real loyal result from your first concept. And why do you think you achieved that? What is, between quotes, the secret or the process that you can keep such a strong, you have a strong concept and you keep it throughout? Maybe it's because it's very straightforward and simple and clear. Regulations don't affect your project. Mechanical floors don't change your project. Air tightness don't change your envelope. Now, it's amazing what you achieve in the end. And what would you explain, or how would you explain this victory?
Again, we were speaking about this afternoon, but I think that the initial strategy has to be multi-layered to survive. If it's just an idea, well then it'll be lightweight and it'll be demolished through the thick and thin of life, let's say. If it's multi-layered, and because we don't go with a strategy until we know that it makes sense architecturally, in terms of the physical and the cultural environment that we're operating in terms of the ethos of the building we're trying to make, in terms of the material that we might want to use. It's not that we know how to do any of those things, but you know when you're onto something that makes sense and that will survive. And when something as basic as fire escape stairs can make the wall of your building, I mean, that's great, because it means you can escape, it means you have solid buttresses, it means you have pleasurable fire stairs, but it's so all the ingredients of the workings of a building we see as opportunities, not as limitations. And I think if a strategy or an idea deals with the complexities that architecture has to deal with, not in terms of actual solution, but just in its thinking even. We knew we had to find a way of making a building in Toulouse which would deal with 40 degrees in the summertime. And we hadn't, Milan, yes, we had, but we knew Milan was going to be fully air-conditioned, and they weren't going to think about that because that wasn't their agenda, although, as I say, we did really push them. But still, the idea of making the outer crust solid and the inner crust more shadowy, that's 50%. And the same in all of the projects. So I don't think it's that. I suppose that's the difficulty about being an architect or being an environmental designer, and it came up in some of the discussions this afternoon, is that architecture is so complex. You have to know that something, that this germ of a strategy or an idea that you have is robust enough to absorb and be enriched by the complexities and not threatened.
And then the small changes will not affect the big.
I mean, there are times when a project. Sometimes there are big changes, but you have to struggle to absorb them. But if it's strong enough, it'll survive. Yeah.
Okay, we have a question over here.
I guess you did the competition without being in the city first. Is that correct?
Sorry?
You did the competition without going to Lima.
Yeah.
So
very dangerous.
Yeah. So my question is, I guess you were saying that you were to the city last week. Does the image that you have from the city, or particularly from the site, has changed? It's basically that. I'm from Lima, so thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much for the project. I really hope you can build it. Yeah.
Maybe we can talk later. Yeah.
That'll be great.
Yeah, actually, we felt very good. I mean, we were nervous about doing competition in a city we'd never been to, but we were encouraged by the fact that we did have somebody in our office who, like a traveller bringing stories, was able to tell us about the city. And when we went, we feel confident about it. It feels right on the site. I suppose mainly because it deals with which isn't particular to Lima. It's very particular to, say, Niamh Brown's project, or many other projects which have two very different conditions. Now we have to develop it in a way which has the cultural resonances that we're talking about. But it's a young project, so the way that we make the wall to the motorway, the way that we make it feel like the surface of the cliff, the way that we make a series of terraces feel like beautiful gardens, which do exist in Lima. We went to the Larco Museum, which is fantastic, where you're moving on these external ramps, weaving your way through gardens. So it's the way we do it. Now we have to live up to that challenge of making it feel very local and more local to that place. I mean, I suppose it's in a part of Lima where it's in the modern part of the city, let's say, which is, I mean, it's a mixture of so many different things on the motorway side. But Barranco is fantastic because that's really there as context. So it's like as if a typical condition of any contemporary city of this huge motorway overlooking a new city exists on the one hand, and then there's Lima, real Lima, let's say, on the other. And we're trying to find a space where the two will be brought together. But what we're really excited about is this whole thing of being able to move externally, that there's a climate where you don't open a door, you go through a gate or something, but that socially, that has so many implications in terms of student life. And what was very interesting about the brief is that they have a cultural component in the brief. In a School of Engineering in Ireland, you would never get a cultural component. But there's a theatre, a cinema, and exhibition space. And there's a wish in a city which is full of gates and guards and all kinds of layers of protection. Their wish is to open the university up to the city, which again is very refreshing, you know. So we're at that stage where we're very positive. I mean, we felt very sensitive last week because in the room were many of the architects who'd done the competition, and you have some really good architects. And it's never a joke to lose and to sit through the winner speaking. You know, you approach it with caution, and it's only if it's really good that you'll, or better. It takes a long time to admit if something is better than what you have done, but they were extremely generous and supportive.
Okay, I can take one last question if anybody wants to raise a hand for last question.
Just have a quick comment.
A question, not a comment.
We were speaking here in the corridor with some of the remarks that presented this afternoon. Two things. One, the level of sensitivity that we felt in all your projects, it's something amazing. I mean, and when you explained the first question you answered, and you said about looking and trying to understand the place. I mean, you really must be a very sensitive person to be able to do that and produce something that has. We can almost see that there is a consistent language in your work, but every building is absolutely one-off and contextual. So it was great inspiration for our sustainable environmental design students.
Can I just say one thing about that? I mean, we come out of, and I see Philip in the audience who worked on the competition with us and has moved on to greater things since then. I mean, we come from an architectural culture. It's not just Grafton Architects. There is and again, it's going back to Fulvio Race's article. It's very interesting to see how if you operate within some kind of cohesive architectural culture, it is enriching. I think it's very difficult to be at that, I don't mean at that level, but to develop and grow alone. And again, that comes back to T.S. Eliot's essay on tradition and the individual talent. I would also like to say that Chris Cross, who was one of my first teachers and was a huge inspiration, is in the audience, and I'm delighted that he's taken the time to come, so he's partly to blame. And I would like to quote Peter Buchanan, who's also in the audience, because he came to Dublin last month and he said, "We won't achieve sustainability unless we learn to revere the earth again," which was a challenge also.
Thank you, Shelley.
Thank you.
Can I